Yeah.
All right, Mr. Earl, we would love to have you come tell us about a review, a proposed review of the St. Louis County Police Department.
I have to tell you, this is the first non-Zoom meeting that I've been in. And given my age, I always goof the Zoom calls up, so I don't think I can goof the in-person meeting up, but I'll let you be the judge of that by the time I'm done. So you want me to go through? Sure. All right. So just to give you a little background history, these discussions started after the first of the year. Talked to the mayor, the county executive, several business folks about, what's happening in our community, particularly as it relates to violent crime. What we had been told, and again, I'll go back a few years before that, the police commissioner in Boston, former police commissioner in Boston, his name is Paul Evans, who will actually be part of this assessment group. Paul had come in and worked exclusively with the city. And one of the things that they had done in Boston, there had been a St. Clair report that was actually, it was one of the most devastating. You would not want this report about your police department. It basically said they were the worst police department in the country, that everything that could be wrong with the police department was wrong with it. The commissioner, who was commissioner at the time, decided that this might not be a bad time to look for something else, and Paul Evans was named acting commissioner. And he decided that if he told me, he said, if I'm going to get fired, I'm going to get fired for what I want to do, not because what I think everybody else wants me to do. So they did a really deep dive assessment of that police department. Where were we good? Where were we strong? Where were we missing the boat? And a couple of things that came out of there is that, and I think this is true today, I think it is, that they put social workers in every police station because his object was to keep people out of the system, not to put people into the system. And they found that it had a profound effect because there were addresses that they were going to all the time, and they found out that in some cases, these were not criminal complaints. This was not a place for a police officer to be. This was a place for a social worker to be. So they worked in the police stations half the day, and then they would go to a boys club or something like Better Family Life that was in the community for the remainder of the day. And they started to see some startling results. And I looked, city of 700,000 people, they haven't been over 50 homicides in probably the last decade. Fast forward 20 years, and his younger brother became police commissioner. He kind of doubled down on this issue of keeping people out of the system. And when he came and spoke to Civic Progress, one of the things he told us was that everybody wants to talk about the low Boston homicide rate. I think his last year they had 25 homicides. It's a city of 700,000 people, goes well over 1 million during the course of the day. He said, but nobody wants to talk about my arrests. He said, they're down as well, and that's what I look at. What are we doing? How are we doing in the community? So anyway, that was sort of the precursor. That's kind of what started some of these conversations. In any event, we decided, business community said, what can we do to help? Because we can do things, let me back up 1 second. The other thing that Paul said is that there's really 3 components of quote community policing, real community policing. What are you doing to prevent it? I mean, who are you partnering with? What kind of programs are out there? What are you doing to try to prevent people from being into the system? What opportunities are you offering? The second is intervention. Who can you intervene with? It's a question of your federal partners. How well do you work with them to try and deal with problems together as opposed to in silo? And finally, the last leg of the stool, as far as he was concerned, was enforcement. This is what we do. We enforce the laws. This is what we do every day. They've had startling results. I don't think anybody could argue with that. In August, former chief Belmar, we were talking, and he mentioned that sort of a Bill Bratton type, somebody who was sort of a bona fide expert in all of this. So you're around long enough, you get to do everything. So when dinosaurs roamed the earth, I actually worked with Bill Bratton. So I called him and I said, can I come and talk to you about this? We're trying to figure this out. Who do you think we should have involved? I talked to him. He said, first thing that has to happen is you have to do an assessment on police departments. Where are you? And he said, I would recommend Chuck Ramsey, who, if you have been here on television set, certainly in the last 3 weeks, he's been on constantly. And another gentleman who I had never heard of by the name of Dan Oates, who was a 20-year NYPD, and he head of intelligence, but chief in a couple of suburban departments. He said, I think those are folks that you need to have. So we said, all right. So we started talking to the mayor and county executive. Are you interested in this? You won't have to pay for it. We'll pay for it. But we want to make sure you're getting the best folks to go after. These are folks that DOJ assessments all over the country. They know the cutting edge in terms of what works in police departments and what doesn't work in police departments. So let me just read the first piece of this. So the first thing they do is a cultural diagnostic. They try to get a sense of the culture of both departments. They'll pay very special attention to training. Are folks being trained properly in terms of racial and cultural sensitivity when they're out? How do they deal with stops, use of force? All of these different things will come in the cultural diagnostic. The second piece is a resource allocation. Right? How are the resources allocated? Being allocated properly? Are they going where they need? They'll look at tools and technologies. There's a lot of technology out there right now. In some cases, maybe it isn't being used up to what it's capable of doing. Then they'll look at crime control strategies. What do you do quickly to try and address some of the violent crime? One of the things that I think, if you talk to Jeff Jensen or some of the other folks, with all the violence that we have, they would tell you that it is actually a small number of people that cause most of it. It's not like there's 300 people out there every night doing this. It's not. It's a small number of people that are doing most of it. So what do you do to make sure that the folks who want to live and be safe in the community, how do you ensure their safety? Then the last piece is how do you work together? How would you work together better? There was an article in today's Post, if you haven't seen it, you should read it. Judge Edwards talked about, I get these, James Clark, my friend from Better Family Life, sends me these things every night. I get them every night, how many people have been shot, how many people have been killed. But Judge Edwards basically said, look, it's all over the city. There isn't any place that I can tell you where we're not having this problem. And what sort of drove a lot of this was that the number of police officers in the city has dwindled. I mean, they are, depending on who you talk to, 100 to 150 short of what their budget allocation is. So we got fewer people to do more things. So the idea that there could be some more collaboration is something that I think we could look at. The other thing I would tell you is this, is that they are coming to town to meet with stakeholders. This board would be a major, if not the major stakeholder. So you'll have a chance to talk to them. These are broad areas of what they're going to look at. Anybody who's ever been through an audit or anything like that knows that it may start here and end up here. And things that are being done, the other side of this thing is that things that the county police department is going to be, many will be validated. Good practice, doing it right. But I think to try to reestablish a relationship in the community, right? To try and figure out how do we reduce this violent crime. St. Louis City is at 116 homicides as of this morning. I mean, I think a reasonable extrapolation will tell you that number is going to be over 200. Colby may be better, he's smarter than I am, so he may be able to tell you far better than I can what that is. But I think that's a reasonable extrapolation. And it hurts this community. It hurts it in 100 different ways. And as I say, I think from the business community standpoint, this is something we can do that you probably couldn't afford to do. Government, I think your budget will, after the COVID, will be hurt. This is something we can do. This is something we want to do. But this isn't something we're trying to force on anybody. So I want to make sure I'm clear on that too. I mean, we want a willing partner. If we're not a willing partner, then we don't want to try to force something on somebody that they don't want. We really don't. But I think it's important to take a look. Best practices, every place I've ever been, company that I work in today, they are constantly reviewing what they do, how can they do it better. And I'll stop and be quiet with this. I'm getting old, so I tell stories, so you have to bear with me on this one. But when I was a graduate student at Harvard, the first case study I had was Burger King and McDonald's. And I thought, you got to be kidding me. I paid all this money to come here. We're going to talk about Burger King and McDonald's. The point of the case was this, that in 1962, Howard Johnson's had 90% of what was then considered the fast food market. And they knew, it wasn't like they were surprised or got took by surprise. They knew that there was this company from the West Coast that was beginning to sort of move across the country called McDonald's. And they made a very conscious decision that what they were doing, the status quo, would work perfectly for them. And he ended the lecture by saying, "There's the lab." Some of you aren't young enough to have been in a Howard Johnson. But he said, when was the last time anyone were in Howard Johnson? So you constantly look at what you do. You constantly look to see if you can do it better. I think these folks are really good people. I mean, you'll be the judge of that. But I think they will give you great recommendations. But they're recommendations. Whether you decide to accept them, implement them, that's up to you. That's not up to us. But we think this tool could be very helpful. I mean, the 7 people shot to killed every night that's happening, and they're children. I mean, we've got young children who are being killed. It's got to stop. We can't. I mean, I can't live in a city. I don't think any of us should. We all get a piece of this. We all got to figure out what can we do to try and make it better. So with that, I will be quiet and I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have.
So for clarification, we have an opportunity to sit with
Sure.
those individuals.
Absolutely.
Listen as well as share our individual concerns.
Absolutely.
collective concerns.
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole point is this isn't just an internal review. They're going external. They want to meet with stakeholders. They need to see how these police departments, both of them, receive not only internally but externally as well. So absolutely, I will guarantee that. That's the one thing I can guarantee. You absolutely will need.
So there's no template, it's however.
Well, I mean, there is a template. They're going to look at these 5 areas, but when they get into a specific area, they may see, you know what, we need to spend a little bit more time here, or we need to look over here, or we missed this based on a stakeholder meeting. We should take a look at this. So, I mean, I think when they do these assessments around the country, this is sort of the template that they do use, but it's not the Rosetta Stone. I mean, it can be changed and people can translate this. And they will do it based on input, if in fact the input results in what they feel would be a better department for the community, for all of us. And it's both departments. I mean, they're both CLIA accredited. They're both good police departments. Folks know that. But as I say, best practices, you can always get better.
So there are 2 individual studies. There's.
Yeah, they will. Well, they'll cross-pollinate. Trust me, they will talk to each other. But Chuck Ramsey and Dan Oates will be the co-leads, and you may meet with Chuck Ramsey one day and maybe Dan Oates another day. The other folks, let me just tell you who else is involved in this thing. The one place that's gotten, the only place that I've seen through the Mr. Floyd protests in the street that actually seems to, the community and the police seem to come together, is Camden, New Jersey. I mean, there have been lots of shots at Camden, New Jersey. Scott Thompson, who was the chief of Camden, New Jersey, will be part of this review. He spent his time there trying to make sure that he built the trust in the community. The other thing I think they will tell you is that community policing it isn't just having sign on the door, right? I mean, this requires a lot of effort to make sure that you do this right, and to make sure that folks really understand that they are in the community, that they're part of the community, which is why they spend so much time looking at the early training.
Okay, one more question.
Sure.
So while they're, if we agree, while they're doing this study, I know we can't walk side by side, we will sort of get echelon reports.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I mean, it does no good for me to have it, right? What am I going to do with it? You need to have it. So I think I feel pretty confident within 60 days, you're going to get some recommendations. Short term, it could be a longer term engagement. We just don't know at this point how long it's going to take. But yeah, I think you get some.
As the process is going on.
Yeah, I mean, they really do. I mean, I know everybody says this, but they really do expect to meet with the public, because they can't do this if they don't. And they have to talk to stakeholders. Now, they're not going to be able to talk to everybody that's going to want to talk to them, but I will tell you they will be available. And again, we're in this new world now, so it may be a Zoom call, it may be something else, I just don't know. But they will do everything they can to communicate. I'll leave my cards here, so that anybody who has a question for me on anything, if I don't have the answer, I'll get it for you.
Other questions? Can you tell us a little bit, for those that don't know, about Chuck Ramsey?
Chuck was the police chief in both Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia. President Obama, he co-chaired 21st Century Policing. He is universally well respected within the law enforcement community, as well as outside of the law enforcement community. He came up through Chicago. He's from Chicago, so he was a Chicago policeman, so he came up through there. It's been one of the things that we were worried about, quite frankly, was whether or not we would be able to get him, because he is in such demand right now that we'd be able to get him to commit to do some work, but he did. Dan Oates, I know less about. He's not as famous. His reputation as a progressive reformer. He spent 22 decades in NYPD. He's been the chief in Miami Beach. He's been the chief in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and he was the chief in Aurora, Colorado during that mass shooting in the movie theater. He was the chief then. Go ahead.
I was going to say, one of the things that we're concerned about now within the department is racial equity, diversity, inclusiveness. Will this study do a deep dive into those areas?
Yeah, it will. I mean, it's things they have to find out. I mean, some of the stuff is they can't really, if they think that you aren't diverse enough, or they think there are things that you should be doing in terms of recruitment, whatever, you're going to get sort of the best practices from around the country, because these folks are familiar with it. But no, it's a huge issue.
I have a thought and a question. From what you just shared, I understand that this is a discussion that has been going on since January 2020, and the nature of the discussion is the concern to reduce violent crime.
It's a little bit fair. I mean, we felt that we truthfully needed to take a look at best practice look. Who's doing what? What are the policies and procedures?
So this is the first time I, as a police board member, am hearing any level of detail about this, and heard about it for the first time in the last few weeks in very terse terms. My concerns are so more fundamental. For instance, why do we think reducing violent crime is an issue for the police? That is a conversation in and of itself. And as far as the review of best practices, we have several rich documents born from the work in this region, whose recommendations and suggestions we have not yet followed. So I am so fundamentally having a hard time understanding how resources, at a time when we're in economic decline, should be put into a review when we're asking a question, which I don't think there is, we need to ask the question before, many questions before that question. And we already have several documents, the Ferguson report, the DOJ report, the homegrown STL report, the STL VPC report, and many others like it that would give us rich local information. So I actually don't have a posture of of openness toward discussing the nature of the study, because I think there's so many foundational questions, which I, as a board member, haven't been privy to despite being on the board, when this discourse began. And this concerns me. This concerns me greatly. Because right now, our communities are looking for action and solutions, and money is tight. So to think we are okay with a posture to think we should spend money on a study rather than action, when action is desperately needed, is extremely concerning to me. So I welcome discourse, but the discourse I would need to have is a far more foundational discourse about what it is we're trying to achieve. I love the idea of business leaders getting involved in the question of violent crime and the behavior of the actors who touch violent crime, which are many. They include the hospital, they include social supports, they include the court system. But I don't think we've had enough of a foundational discourse about how to touch those things and how to change our region's experience of violent crime. And I'm really delighted to know that next we're going to hear from the SDL VPC, which is a regional effort that has been working now for years on answering the question of violent crime, that has a deep wisdom that I think we all could learn from, that doesn't need to do any more studies because they've done the work and could actually guide us in action. So I just must make these cautionary statements. With all due respect, this is very, very concerning.
I hear you, and I can't, communication channels, I can't really answer that question. I will tell you that when we had these discussions, we had started to talk to folks outside, and then we're here, so it kind of ended. But the other thing, I'm going to assure you again, I'm not asking you to spend any money. This is a group of folks that said they will spend money on this. That's what they want to do. So that's kind of where it is.
Go ahead.
I just, I asked earlier about a temple.
Sure.
So probably sort of playing off of what the doctor mentioned. Will there be efforts, we talked about the racial disparities, will there be efforts to look at the impact of structural racism that may, what we know causes some of the violence that we see in certain communities? So is that a part of what they're planning to look at? Or where would that be?
I think where they're going to be is that there will be conversations that obviously will be private conversations, so that people are free to say what they want to say and what they feel. They'll talk to folks inside and outside. They will make recommendations about the issues that you just raised. I can't tell you I know everything we're going to do because I don't. I won't until they come and start. But I do think these folks have vast experiences here in police departments. And that's really what we're kind of looking at here.
I mean, it sounds really interesting to me. What the concern is, and you mentioned earlier that we have opportunities to meet with.
Oh, yeah, that part I will guarantee.
Okay. So I guess what I'm saying is, so if we say, well, we really want to focus our attention more on the structural issues, will they say, that sounds great, but that's not what we do?
Well, I think it's the level of engagement, how long the engagement goes. And I think that's going to be up to, how we receive it. Obviously that would be a longer engagement, but we're prepared to go for a long haul here. And we are. We're trying to figure out how do you get the best possible service to the people that live in this community, all the people.
Okay, so I guess that's what I'm really wanting to. Will there be limitations on what we need?
There may,
I know there'll be some, but
there'll be some financial limitations. This is not, I don't have a blank check, but there'll be some financial limitations, obviously. But as I say, we're prepared to issues that they want to look at, they need to address, assuming that we have the budget for it, we will certainly do it.
okay, and that's what I guess I'm saying.
Yeah.
I don't want them to say, this is what we do, know, and we hear your concern, but we saw it.
Yeah, and I think honestly, I think all of them have dealt with the issues that you're talking about when they were heads of running police departments. I don't think you're gonna tell them anything that you haven't heard before. I haven't looked at it.
So next question then, will we have some sort of written document to review before they come? Because I've heard what you said and the points that you made, and I think that they're important, but is there something that we can just kind of look at and see, a proposal, I guess is what I'm thinking about?
That's kind of what I've outlined. I think the key in terms of what they do is based on the conversations they're going to have. I mean, it's, as I say, I've been through 100 business looks, and we say we want you to look at procurement because we really think we have an issue here. And they say, yeah, you know, actually, it's okay. Here's your issue. It's over here. And so defining it before it even starts, I think the way for them to sort of frame what they're going to do would be have some of these stakeholder meetings. I think that would help them a lot.
So am I understanding correctly then that this is more of an offer from the business community that says we see a potential problem, we see a problem, an issue, come in, meet with, for example, us,
Sure.
who we've been acquainting ourselves with the department and working with the department to identify and narrow the action items.
But I mean, I don't want to back off the issue. I mean, of Island Department. We do have an issue here. I mean, there's no question about it. I mean,
So that's the fruit of.
well, it's not the fruit. No, as I said, there are three, I think Paul Evans summed it up pretty nicely. There are three areas that you have to pay attention to. There's prevention, intervention, and then enforcement. But I mean, as I said, we reported, at least in the city, county side is harder for me to follow. Globally, I've dealt with that. But in the city, as of today, it's 160 homicides. Let me just put this in perspective. Cincinnati has roughly the same demographics as St. Louis. They're actually a little bit bigger. They're slightly over 300,000. By the mid-decade census, I suspect St. Louis would be under 300,000. What would you guess the last FBI report, which was 2018? We had 187 homicides. How many homicides do you think Cincinnati had? Which has had a really troubled relationship between the community and the 57. So there are strategies that can be employed that can work. The key issue here is it can't be one in a silo, right? They have to work together.
Right. So for example, our first precinct is populated predominantly with African Americans. Right? So we look at the numbers and we see more criminal activity there, but we also see a lack of resources there. And that's what I guess I'm getting at.
Yeah, no, I think that's an
something
important
that
part.
we'll be looking at that in terms of where the root of the problem is. I mean, there's some bad actors who just are going to be bad actors, but then there are other folks who are desperate. And in their desperation, they may do some things that are illegal, or that create problems. So that's what I'm.
No,
trying to get at.
and I agree with you. When it wasn't my last year, but somewhere it was after Michael Brown had been killed in August of 2014. So the civic progress allocation, after we had talked to Commissioner Evans from Boston, our allocation was in what I would say partnerships. So we spent $150,000 on Save Our Sons. Spent another $150,000 on Better Family Life with James Clark. Spent another $100,000+ on summer works, I think. It's a very good program. Then a little bit foundation. So that's where we put our resources. We put our resources there for the last 3 or 4 years. So since I've left, I'm no longer at Civic Progress. I actually tried to retire. Not very good at it. But so that's, yeah, I mean, I think those are conversations. It may not be directly with this group, but it certainly would be with other folks. saying, I mean, and those are all recommendations from the Ferguson Commission, every one. There's no summer jobs, put money in summer jobs. That, you know, the little ones need more help going to school, we did that. Certainly de-escalation, that's what James Clark has done for a long time.
He's sitting, he's now with,
With the urban league, well, I think he's city and county, in fact, I think he worked, if I'm not mistaken, I'm pretty sure he worked with St. Louis County for a while. He's out there every night, don't worry about it, he's out there every night.
Any more questions?
I just want to thank you for coming in today and answering our questions, and most importantly, what you're doing for the St. Louis community. I truly appreciate what you've done and what your cohorts have done. Thank you.
Do we have a motion to participate in this public question?
Sorry to jump in after such a nice comment, but, is there a timeline? Is there a timeline?
Yeah, I mean, it's gonna depend, I mean, it's gonna depend on receptivity, it's gonna depend on, you know, cooperation and how we're able to get stuff. You know, these folks will know if they get slow walked, I can tell you that much, pretty quickly. So the timeline would be the original, I think, you see some initial recommendations in about 60 days.
from the time they come in.
Time they commit to start, yeah.
Do we have an expected time that they might come in?
Yeah, I mean, they're ready to go now. I think Chief has spoken to former Chief Oaks, I believe. I think Chuck Ramsey has spoken to John Hayden, so they're ready to go. I mean, the issue now, honestly, which is sort of everything miserable, is we're getting people actually getting them here. You know, when traveling and getting on airplanes, getting them here. That's way more complicated than it has been.
More discussion, more questions. Do we have a motion?
So I'd like to move that we accept the invitation to research further the opportunities for this consulting firm.
Second, is there a second?
I'll second.
Okay. Further discussion?
I am not open to this conversation. I'm open to the prior conversation, which is concerns about the violent crime and concerns about the practice of the police department. That is a conversation which I would second, and I do not second starting with a conversation about study. I do not agree with that.
Just so that I can understand and we can have a conversation about this,
Sure.
can you articulate or outline maybe in a little different way the conversation that you'd like what's the question you would like to discuss?
I would like the opportunity to discuss with your leadership what your concern is and how that concern can be approached. There has been a decision that the way to approach the concern is with a study and an outside consultant. That decision I was not part of. I don't believe anybody on the board was part of it. Perhaps they were, I don't know. And that concerns me.
So
Because putting money, it doesn't matter that it's not the police department's money, it's still resource, into a study when we have multiple actionable things right here, right now, that people are begging to be supported. Begging. I cannot condone using any resource, regardless of where it comes from, for a study, because it is nearly emotionally abusive, gaslighting, to ignore the multiple studies people have worked blood, sweat, and tears for in this region, and to act like we don't know what we need to do. We know what we need to do. And so, I mean, I have to be that explicit about it, because it's as if we are saying, well, we don't understand what's going on. It is a horrific insult to the leaders who have put their life's work into defining how we can go forward as a region. We know. And if there is resource, it should go into that, not into another study. That is my opinion. And if the question is, well, let's discuss how we go forward as a region, then sure. But if the question is this study okay and what should it study, it's fundamentally flawed, a flawed approach approach to where we are and how we can go forward. And I cannot condone it.
I need all of you to help me rephrase the motion, because I'm intentionally trying to phrase it so that it would be open to our questioning whether or not we agree to go forward. Not that the motion was saying, yes, we're going to go forward with the study, but that we would be open to listening to those representatives and seeing if they could actually address some of our needs. And so do I need to restate it, or?
I think there's a problem with saying the consultants need to come at all. I think where the conversation needs to start, if there's a desire for a conversation, is with your leadership itself. As soon as we bring outside consultants, we've invested. So I think it's too, that's what I said, there's a question before the
But I
question.
didn't even say that, I didn't say that.
Well, that is what's being said, so that's why I'm.
No, that's why I intentionally did not say that, which leaves room actually for leadership from Civic Progress to come in if we determine that that's what it is, and or those representatives to meet with us in the Zoom meeting or such to save the travel, that kind of thing. But that was my intention, to make it broad enough that it includes those issues, and not that it's rubber stamping another study.
All right, let's clarify the motion.
Yes.
Yeah, would you?
I said, can you say what I said, please? Because I don't know what I said.
Yeah, you want further discussion on if you're gonna go over with the study, you want to evaluate what they're gonna do.
Did you write down exactly what I said?
I would make a motion to have
I've got to rescind mine in order for you to do that. I'm not rescinding it yet because I want it to be clear. I don't want to rescind it. Let me see if I can say what I think I said. Yep. I think I said that I move that we as a board invite representatives in order to further discuss their opportunity, something like that. What did I say? I think I said, I try to make it broad enough so that it's inclusive of whoever we think we need to talk to. If we think that we need to talk to the gentleman that you mentioned, so that we can hear what they're saying, and if they're not meeting our needs, then we can say, thank you, but this isn't what we really need. I think that's what I was trying to say.
Just to clarify, are you talking about talking with Chuck Ramsey and Dan Oaks, people who will be doing this study?
I'm talking about those and others, which could include, if we ask, maybe some additional representation from Civic Progress. I did not say specifically Ramsey and Oaks, because I wanted it to be broad enough that if whatever we think we need.
Let me see if I can.
Can we, I tell you what, so if we're gonna do Robert's rules, can we get a second and then you discuss? Can I get can we do as not until you get a second. Second is only to discuss, it's not to approve.
I'm still confused.
Okay, so I'm saying I made this motion, according to Robert's rules of order, it has to be seconded before discussion.
I'm sorry, I'm not totally clear on the motion.
Okay, so my motion is that we, oh my goodness, I wish you would. That I could hear it again. My motion is that we as a board hear in more detail from the representatives of the organizational consultants and others regarding the specific needs of our police department. That's not exactly what I said before, but that's what I meant.
Where I'm struggling is that what I heard was that there would be this study that's undefined that would allow our input to define. So my concern is hearing more isn't necessarily going to give us more information because our input is needed to generate that.
So what I'm saying, the motion is that when we have opportunity to give the input, if we don't think that they're meeting our needs, that we can say thanks, but no thanks. Or we can say, we've heard from other organizations that seem to be able to fit our needs better than what you're talking about. That's what I'm saying. I would like to hear more in detail. I appreciate your presentation, and I think it was really, really helpful. But in terms of the ability for us to say, this is what we're talking about. This is what we believe is a part of what the problem is. We want you, yeah, okay, let's look at, you want to look at the violent crime fine, but not without looking at some of these other factors. That's what I've got in my head. I can't say all of that in emotion. And I still say, you have to have a second to discuss. You don't have the second is not to agree.
I will second to discuss.
Yeah, the only thing I want to make sure I'm clear, I'm not trying to force anybody to do anything, but we're not going to expend funds needlessly either. I mean, so if you don't want to do it, I'd appreciate knowing it now, because I know the city does want to do it. And again, I'm not trying to force anybody to do anything. It would be better, I think, with the future of the region, you're going to have fewer and fewer police. You have to figure out how you're going to deal with that at some point. But honestly, this is not a cheap engagement, and the funds are not going to be directed somewhere else. You know, I'm just going to be clear about that. The funds have been allocated for this period, and if you don't want to do it, that's okay. But I need to know that. The sooner the better.
My understanding of Rockville Schools is we vote per motion and then we have an alternate motion.
If I vote it down, right, or if you still want to do an additional motion, that's fine.
Or amend, can I excuse amend the motion?
You can just do that now.
Okay, yeah, here's what I think this is a wonderful opportunity. I understand that we need action, not continual studies. As it's been described, it's an opportunity that allows our involvement, our participation, our help to focus, so that it's a useful study for us. I think we should proceed with it on that basis, that we thank the community for offering this. And the representation is this can happen very quickly. We'll know if you need something else or not. I see no reason not to allow others to help us. So my amendment, it would just be that we go ahead and proceed with a welcome this step.
The only concern that I have is how influential will our input.
If our input isn't influential, it would seem to me they don't have good stuff.
Yeah, I agree.
I mean, we are key to making this stuff.
think your first motion opened it up for involvement like this.
Yeah.
You know,
I mean, I
so-
tried to. say it.
And I think you said it because I wrote it down. I just reread it, so I think your motion
But
did.
tell me.
I just wrote it down.
Iterations.
But I can't remember my name. But I think with Judge Price's amendment, I think it gets us there if we need to get there. That's all.
Okay. Do you accept the amendment?
I said,
Do we have a second?
Give me a second.
Do we have more discussion? Ready?
I would just like
Go
to,
ahead, sure.
I want to make a comment. I think that the study can be useful in several ways, and can be targeted and applied in a way that does not disregard or disrespect prior existing studies by any means.
Okay, that's it.
I imagine that Mr. Ramsey and Mr. Oates will likely do their due diligence. They seem like very thorough professionals. And I'd be surprised if they didn't bring to the table at least reading through the studies that are already existing, and hope that along with meeting us and discussing our priorities and concerns and interests, which we collectively have gathered over our experience as board members, can help target their approach to this. And one thing that I consider that we ask their assistance in is prioritizing action items that we can apply our resources and energy towards.
Further discussion? All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
All opposed?
Oh,
Motion carries. Thank you very
Thank you.
much.
No, thank you.
Look forward to participating.
You're welcome.
Now, it's appropriate, we're going to move with your guest, Commissioner Punch, the St. Louis Violence Prevention Commission.
so
Yeah, we tested it earlier. Jessica, go ahead and share your screen. Jessica, you need to unmute yourself.
Thank you. And then Serena Mohammed is also going to be presenting. If we could get her unmuted as well, please.
Okay, thank you. So thanks for allowing us this time. My name is Serena Mohammed with the St. Louis Mental Health Board, and that was Jessica Myers. And we are representing the St. Louis Area Violence Prevention Commission. And we wanted to go over some specific recommendations on policing and violence prevention that we've been working on regionally for the past few years. Jessica's going to run the slides for me, and I'll just go through a few of the first to set some context. So we rely a lot on looking at the public health approach to violence prevention. We understand from looking at research that's been done by the Prevention Institute that there are many drivers of violence, so that a response to violence cannot be focused solely on law enforcement. We have to make sure that we have those community partners, those institutions that are also working together to ensure that we're addressing all of the aspects that drive violence in our region. So the Violence Prevention Commission has about 130 member organizations that represent workforce, that represent economic development, higher education, philanthropy, all of us bringing our individual sectors together to look at how we can have some cross-cutting strategies. When we talk about the public health approach, I'm on slide 3, there are actually 4 components to that public health approach. The first is that you define the problem. And as has been mentioned, there have been some studies that have been done nationally as well as locally that really look at the drivers of violence in the St. Louis region. One of those studies that we have focused in on was done by the Department of Justice for the city of St. Louis in 2017. So in 2018, we developed our strategy in partnership with the St. Louis County Department of Public Health, with the St. Louis City Department of Health, the United Way of Greater St. Louis, Washington University Institute for Public Health, and many other organizations really dove into those findings from that study, as well as other local and national studies, to understand the drivers of violence in our region. And then we identified risk and protective factors that are specific to those drivers of violence. And we're in the stage now of actually implementing some of those strategies to ensure that we have the widespread adoption that's needed. It's also important to note that the Violence Prevention Commission, in addition to working with our institutional partners, work very closely with community members. So we work with people who are directly impacted by violence, what we call affected community members, to get their lived experience to understand what exists within the community already that can be leveraged as a strength, and what gaps we need to address as we're putting together our strategy. So this fourth slide really gets to our action plan. I talked about the involvement of the health department. There is a regional effort to make sure that there's a public health approach to violence prevention that includes the health systems as well as the health department. And when we look at that regional effort, we looked at where we would have the greatest opportunity for transformational change. So when you think about violence prevention, there are lots of activities that you can pursue, but we prioritize these three as having the greatest level of impact. So the first one is improving the community level response to non-fatal shooting. And I'll just explain what that means. When we talk about the homicide rate, we're usually very alarmed at the number of homicides that happen in our region, but we don't focus on the non-fatal shootings, which are actually usually 5 times as much as the homicides. So when we're talking homicides, we're in the hundreds. When we're talking about non-fatal shootings, we're in the thousands. And that's an opportunity to intervene and break cycles of violence. Our second objective is to really look at trauma-informed and evidence-based violence prevention. Because this is a personal issue for so many people, and they're passionate about wanting to do something, sometimes we have the tendency to do what seems to be the most appropriate intervention without taking the time to really step back and look at the evidence. We have the benefit of having our university partners and others who help us hone in on what the evidence says works, so that we're focusing our attention on those solutions that will be the most fruitful. And then the third objective is really looking at how we activate communities to strengthen police legitimacy. And I emphasize communities because when we talk about the relationship between law enforcement and communities, it really needs to be bi-directional, and we need to be working on both sides of that equation. And for those who have not heard the term police legitimacy before, I just want to give kind of the textbook definition. Police legitimacy is defined as the degree to which citizens believe that the police are honest, trying to do their job, and protecting the citizens from crime and violence. So this sense of legitimacy is improved when you have procedural justice. And that procedural justice has to include citizen voice. So that means looking at fairness, respect, caring, and how the citizens actually interact with police. And our role as the VPC is to work with the community on these issues as well as with law enforcement. So for this past year, we've really been focused in on Objective 3, police legitimacy. And that's what we want to share with you today, some of the results that have come out of that work and the recommendations. So I'll turn it over to Jessica.
So in this work that we did last year, we had several types of community input. We had community listening sessions. Thank you to Dr. Punch. They hosted our first community listening session at the T in January of last year. We also did interviews with 15 police officers between St. Louis City and St. Louis County. Again, we are a regional effort. And the themes that came out of that about community policing and police legitimacy are human resources. How do we recruit, retain, and promote officers that are representative of the community, but also want to engage in the community? Transparency, how does information flow from the police department to the community? And how accountability, how does that information flow back from the community to the police department? Community engagement practices and alternative to police contact. We hear a lot about how police have taken on a lot of cases that aren't necessarily traditional police work. So how do we promote solutions that address those concerns, but don't necessarily require police contact. So we also did an online survey where we allowed people to talk about police legitimacy. Generally, St. Louis County had higher ratings of police legitimacy on this scale. So it was 24 questions. 1 was strongly disagree to 5 strongly agree. And so in general, St. Louis County was rated higher on police legitimacy. But we did want to look at some of the lowest rated statements for St. Louis County. And they're really about equity and they're about accountability. So people generally disagreed that police enforce the laws the same way across all people and serve all people equally. And they also generally disagreed that police admit when they make mistakes or get things wrong. But it's not all negative. So some of the highest rated statements are about participation with police. And in general, all of the respondents, the average said we'd be willing to work with police officers if we saw people acting suspiciously or to help find a criminal or to report a crime. And also, in general, people agreed that most police officers in their neighborhood do their job well. So we take this to mean that although there are concerns that citizens have about equity and accountability, they're still willing to engage in the process of talking about policing. And so this is really the context for where our recommendations come from. So I'll turn it back over to Serena.
So the first recommendation is really one that could be transformative in community and police relationships. And that's to infuse public input into the police department collective bargaining agreement. So this happens in other cities across the country. It's not something that is novel. It doesn't happen in our region. But one of the opportunities that it affords us is for citizens to understand what actually happens in police departments, what some of the constraints are, what some of the rules and regulations are, that procedural justice piece, so that they have a better ability to interact in a positive way and to be supportive and helpful. So as I mentioned, it's a bi-directional relationship. And if one piece of it looks like a black box, then that puts the other side at a disadvantage. So looking at this collective bargaining agreement is an opportunity to address all 4 things of what came out of that police legitimacy survey of some of the things that people want to see addressed in our region. The other piece of this, when you look at this recommendation further, for those of us who are not as familiar with collective bargaining agreements, this is an opportunity to really look at how we address misconduct and some of those other things that have started to create a fissure between citizens and law enforcement. But it also gives protections to police officers who are really doing the best that they can to ensure that they're delivering high quality service for the citizenry. So when you look at what the collective bargaining agreements cover, on this left side, it talks about your complaint procedures, your civilian oversight, your use of force, many of the things that are starting to come into the national discourse about how we improve policing. We looked at the collective bargaining agreement for St. Louis County, and there are 2 areas of opportunity when we talk about how we might consider changes going forward. So one of those is directly related to use of force or disciplinary actions. The way that the agreement is currently set up, it would be very difficult to establish a use of force database or to really understand disciplinary actions that are taking place. So the collective bargaining agreement process is an opportunity to address that specific barrier. And then there's also a piece of the language that talks about the psychological conditioning or when it's appropriate for somebody to submit to psychological testing. And this is not an uncommon thing. This appears in many collective bargaining agreements, but what it does is that it prevents proactive mental health analysis. And one of the things that we know from talking to law enforcement is that they don't always use their employee programs around receiving counseling and mental health supports. And out of all of the first responders that you could imagine, they're in a very significant deficit if they don't have access to those mental health resources because of the level of trauma that they encounter on a regular basis. So they may, in the collective bargaining agreement process, be establishing barriers that prevent some officers from accessing those mental health services. So then this next slide really talks about what does it look like to have public input in a process like this. Because we haven't done it before in our region, we looked at how it's been done successfully in other regions just to give us some recommendations or some ideas. The first thing that's important is the public education. People really need to understand what's in the current agreement. Where are there opportunities for improvement? What are things that we need to protect because they're working well? This is an opportunity to have a co-facilitated conversation with police department, community liaison officers, or whoever is designated, as well as a third party, to ensure that the public can get a better understanding of what some of the limitations and constraints are and what the opportunities are. There's an opportunity to do focus groups, to really listen to police officers about what they see as opportunities for strengthening the department. There's an opportunity to do public meetings where we examine what works well in other places, and then to have strategy sessions once we have this information, once we've been educated collectively and we're on the same page about what transparency and accountability in policing can look like. I think it's important to emphasize that systems do not self-correct. There is always a need for an external force or an external partner to come in and work with you and help you as you're looking at how to navigate some of these difficult issues. It's the same for law enforcement, for hospital systems, for education, the use of external parties who are not a part of that sector, who have a different perspective and a different set of expertise to come in and problem solve is a critical element in making sure that you're really establishing a process that's transformative and that includes the concerns and needs of everyone involved. Jessica?
So there was one other piece that we wanted to go back to when we were kind of highlighting our recommendations. And our full recommendations are available on our website. But when we were looking at some of the different demographic issues, we wanted people to be able to self-identify their age, race, their gender identity, and their sexual orientation, because we know those type of demographic factors are all intersectional when it comes to experiences of policing. And so when we broke it down by some of those demographic groups, the lowest overall ratings of police legitimacy were from people who identified as members of the LGBTQ community. And so on average, people who identify as gay or trans generally rated police a 0.5 point lower on average than their straight cisgender peers. Overall, the lowest ratings in this group came from people who identified as transgender, gender nonconforming, gender non-binary, or genderqueer. As I mentioned earlier, we had 24 questions that we asked people to rate from a scale of 1 strongly disagree to 5 strongly agree. For the transgender and gender nonconforming community, the most common answer for 22 of the 24 items was 1 out of 5. Meaning the majority of the people that identified as transgender strongly disagreed with those ratings of police legitimacy. And it's because of that that one of our recommendations is to develop and publicize a policy on interaction with transgender and gender nonconforming people. And I think it's great that Lieutenant Wildhaber was presenting, because I think it dovetails very well into the work that the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Group is doing. There are model policies that we have collected that are linked in our recommendations. Some of the things that we should look at are prohibiting the use of gender identity as the basis to stop, question, or search someone, prohibit harassment based on gender identity, edit report templates to allow individuals to identify as different gender identities besides male and female, allow people to provide a name they currently use in addition to their legal name on police reports. And also, one of the biggest issues that we've heard from the transgender and gender nonconforming community is concerns about where they will feel safest if they have to be held in a gender segregated facility. And so best practices from the Trans Equity Project is to allow individuals to choose where they feel safest when they're being detained. And so one of our recommendations here, not only to develop that, but to publicize that. As Serena mentioned, when the people that responded to our survey and our events often talked about kind of the black box, that things happen in the police department, policies are created, and they don't necessarily have a lot of input, and they don't know when policies are changed. And so publicizing is a very important part of this policy process to allow the trans community to have input into how this policy is created and how it is publicized, so people know how they can feel safe when they do come into interactions with law enforcement. And as I said, we have about 12 to 13 recommendations. Our website is stlareavpc.org. You can find all of our recommendations there, and we'd be happy to take any questions if there are any questions from the board.
I just have one comment, and that is thank you for your time and in consolidating quite an extensive amount of research into this presentation. I think we all appreciate it.
Thank you, and we'd be happy to take time to discuss any other specific recommendations with any board members or anyone within the police department who's interested.
I'm sure this isn't the last time we'll be able to visit, and we might want to take segment by segment with you so we can go into a little more depth and detail with it. But I thought a number of your recommendations were very helpful.
Thank you.
And you're on that board, Commissioner?
I'm part of I'm not on their board, but I'm part of the.
Very good. So we can keep in touch. Thank you. Do I have a motion to approve the minutes from the meeting on June 10th and June 30th? Second?
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? It looks like we have a number of contracts, a police service agreement with the Village of Wilbur Park, with the City of Bella Villa, with the City of Woodson Terrace, with the City of Breckenridge Hills. Do I have a motion to approve those contracts?
So moved.
Favor? Aye. Any opposed? There's a recommendation on a general order. Chief, do you want to present that? Oh, it's tougher, or is it your motion, or the general order on teletype and Regis terminal policy?
Yes, that's it.
Would you briefly describe that?
So the general order on Regis and teletype policy has to do with these, generally these computer messages that are sent for people who are wanted or have warrants. It's connected to the court system. We had to do some updating on that I believe it was last year. We eliminated misdemeanor wanteds, and so it reflects that. It also updates the language on stopping and detaining individuals who have certain classifications of these sort of arrest orders, stop orders. It's just really to give the officers more information so we don't get ourselves into bad situations as far as detaining people too long when they don't have the legal authority to do so.
Anybody have any questions on the general order? Do we have a motion?
So moved.
Second. Discussion? All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
All right. In public forum, do we have anyone in the public forum?
If you'd like to speak, please electronically raise your hand on Zoom. You can do that by going down to the bottom of the screen on the participants button. If you click on that, there should be a raise hand. Just bear with me while I find everyone. It looks like Kevin Wyndham would like to speak. So, Mr. Wyndham, I will unmute you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wrote a letter to the Board of Police Commissioners on June 25th, and I just wanted to read it into the public record. Chair Price, as the largest and one of the most diverse counties in Missouri, I believe that the St. Louis County Police Department should be exemplary within the state and country. To that end, I have several concerns that I would like to bring to your attention regarding transparency and diversity within the St. Louis County Police Department. Currently, the website for the Board of Police Commissioners does not have any recorded videos of board meetings, with the exception of listening sessions held to choose our new police chief. Also, there has not been any meeting minutes posted on the Board of Police Commissioners website since April 22nd, 2020. To increase transparency and community input, I would like to see the St. Louis County Police Department post board meetings and notices on social media in addition to YouTube and the police board website. Regarding diversity, I'm disappointed to have learned that of the 963 officers in the St. Louis County Police Department, only 99 are Black. Of those 99 Black officers, 19 serve at a rank above that of police officer, with only 3 of those 19 being Black women. For these reasons, as it relates to hiring, training, and promotions, I would like to know what practices are currently being implemented to increase diversity, equity, and inclusion within the St. Louis County Police Department. I look forward to hearing from the board soon regarding my concerns.
Thank you. And just to respond to one of the questions, we are working on the website now, and hopefully we can improve that.
I don't see anyone else with their hand raised.
All right, if there's no one else, the Board of Police Commissioners may vote to go into closed meeting for review of claims and lawsuits involving the police department. Section 610-0211 RSMO, Section 114-0201 SLCRO. Discussion of employee and personnel matters, Section 610-0213 and 13 RSMO, in Sections 114-0203 and 13 SLCRO. And an update on union negotiations, Section 610-021, 9 RSMO, in Section 114-0209 SLCRO, and specifications for competitive bidding, Section 610-021, 11 RSMO, and Section 114-02011 SLCRO. Do we have a motion to go into closed session?
I so move.
Second.
The board's returned from closed session. Do we have a motion to adjourn?
Second.
All in favor? Is this a roll call?
It's
adjourn.
up to you.
Okay, if it's not all in favor?
Aye.